Welcome to the Emerging Civil War YouTube page. I'm Chris Mackowski, and I am joined with two of my emerging Civil War colleagues, Sarah Kay Beirle, the managing editor of our blog, and Terry Rensel, a member of our editorial board. And we're all here kind of with dual purposes today. We can kind of switch hats back and forth because not only are we involved with emerging Civil War, but we're also involved with Central Virginia Battlefield Trust. And Terry is the executive director of CVBT. Why don't I have you start by just telling us a little bit about what CVBT is and give us the rundown.
CVBT is a local grassroots battlefield preservation organization, and we deal only with the lands associated with the four battles here in the Fredericksburg area: Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, the Wilderness, and Spotsylvania Courthouse. We were founded and started up in 1996. Our first preservation project was Willows Hill, now part of the national park right there at the visitor center in downtown. And in our history, we've saved over 1,300 acres of battlefield land.
Now, one of the more recent acquisitions that CVBT has managed to save is a piece out at the Spotsylvania battlefield called Myers Hill. May 14th is the anniversary of the action at Myers Hill. And Sarah, I know you have spent a lot of time tromping around out there. Tell us just a little bit about the sort of the nature of the property and being out there.
Sure. So the piece of property that we are preserving is 73.3 acres. So it's a nice chunk of land. At the time of the battle in 1864, it would have been pretty open because it was farm fields. But over the years, that has changed. So it's kind of dense brush out there right now. There are some ways to walk through. So hiking's all right. And we're trying to figure out how to make it a little more accessible to the public for the future. But a couple weeks ago when I was out there, I had a bit of a scare. I had been thinking that I needed to be careful of snakes. And then I was going through this area and all of a sudden there's this scurrying in the brush. And I looked down expecting to see a little mouse or something like that. And it was a great big black snake. And that was the first time I'd encountered a snake on a battlefield here in Virginia. So I did not scream. That's the really good part. But then I was trying to figure out where to go next so I wouldn't meet it again. But it is a really beautiful piece of land, and it is not flat. And when you get out there, you can definitely tell here's the hill, and you start getting to the crest, and it takes a little bit of imagination to try to see it without the trees. But fortunately, there's a few sketches that were made around the time of the battle, so that can really help also.
Terry, I'm going to shift gears over to you here for just a second and just to share your impressions of the property as well.
It's really surprising. If you don't know that it's there, you don't know that there's this high piece of ground there. It's kind of shielded by development on two sides, and the woods and the Nye River on a third side. But once you're on the property, you can, part of it that has a power line easement going through it, you can tell the change in elevation there and how much it does rise when you're walking the trails that are already on the property, especially as you're heading past the part of the property that has the Myers homestead on it, back towards the Nye River where the Union Army came across. It's this really fascinating change in elevation and topography, and you can see why it was such an important piece of land.
One of the things that I always have found interesting about it is if you come at it from the south along Massaponax Church Road, you don't necessarily notice that it's a hill because it seems kind of just coming at it from a plateau. But walking up the property from the north, you really get a sense of the dramatic rise and incline there. And really that's kind of what made it an attractive piece of ground initially for both Confederates and Federals. It's going to serve as the right flank for the Confederate Army during the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, and the Third Corps under the temporary command of Jubal Early is going to be stretched down into that area. But after Grant's setback at the Mule Shoe, he's going to shift his army on the 13th of May and start swinging it down around, getting around or trying to get around Lee's right. And he's going to see Myers Hill, and he's going to try to mass a huge section of the army to attack against Myers Hill. At that point, Lee doesn't recognize that his flank is vulnerable. He doesn't necessarily understand that the Federals are trying to mass against it, and so he does not react quickly to that. But because of the rains that have been going on, the roads are mired down, Grant's not able to move his army fast enough to get into position for a dawn attack. That's part of the learning curve that Grant is struggling with as he comes to the east. He's used to that smaller, faster army that he had out in the west, and so the Army of the Potomac does not move that way. And so all these quick marches and quick attacks that he tries to plan for, which in theory sound great, he's not able to get his troops into place for. I'm going to try the magic of screen sharing here for just a moment. And let's see, here we go. Take a look at this cool map. Again, kind of talking about the CVBT ECW connections. This was a map put together by Emerging Civil War's Edward Alexander from Make Me a Map LLC. And this shows the piece of ground, the movement of the Union troops in the blue, the Confederates down here. Actually, this is going to be the counterattack, but we can kind of see here we've got the Confederate line. This is the modern day park. On the 13th, the 9th Corps had been in this area and hunkered down. And so the 5th Corps kind of swings down in around, and the 6th Corps is then going to swing down and further over. So you've got Horatio Wright's 6th Corps here. You've got Gouverneur K. Warren's 5th Corps here. This is the area right in here that my wife's family owns at Stevenson Ridge, which we talk about a fair amount. And so the idea was that Grant was going to align these portions of the army and sweep up over in this direction to hit Lee's right flank. He's not able to do that, but they still do see the value of this high ground. It's occupied by the 9th Virginia Cavalry. Those are local boys from this area who are occupying that area. And so we're first going to have a couple federal units, the 91st Pennsylvania and the 140th New York, charge up in this direction from the 5th Corps. Now, folks who are familiar with the Overland Campaign know that these guys were involved in the opening action of the Battle of the Wilderness in Saunders Field, so they have taken some huge hits, some huge casualties, so they're pretty small regiments by this point, but they do successfully drive the 9th Virginia off the hill. At the same time over here, the 6th Corps is going to then send Emory Upton's brigade up to the top, and Upton's going to get there just after these two regiments have cleared off the hillside, and so Upton is then going to deploy out here to try to hold that position. He's going to realize that he's feeling kind of naked out there, and he's going to call for some reinforcements who are going to start to come in this direction. But that even as these guys try to start moving forward, Jubal Early is going to try to respond and try to get that hill back. And so he's going to send a couple brigades of Confederate from Little Billy Mahone's division to come up here. They're going to be backed by John Chambliss's cavalry, of which the 9th Virginia, which is now down in here, is part of. And they're going to have a sweeping counterattack to drive Upton's men off the top of the hill. Now, as all this back and forth has gone on, after the Federals capture the top of the hill, Army Commander George Gordon Meade decides he's going to come up here and see the day's prize. Terry, you want to tell me just a little bit about that?
Yes, General Meade comes across the Nye River and everything, and is in the area of the farmhouse, and some reports say they actually were having a meeting in the Myer house. When the Confederates counterattacked, Meade and his staff and everyone there just barely got out of the house and back on their horses just ahead of the Confederate troops, and they almost captured him. He escaped down the hill and back across the Nye River. As you can see, this reproduction of the drawing represents that scene. Crosses the river, is absolutely irate that the Confederates counterattacked and drove his troops off the hill and almost got himself captured. So he orders a Union counterattack to retake the hill.
So, and that's where, if we go back to the map here in just a second, and, let me bring that up here. That's where we then start to see these elements, these additional elements from the 6th Corps start to come in here to try to take that hill back. I think it's a great moment where Meade just shows his spleen. He's so upset. He's going to send divisions worth of men up there to sort of redeem his shaken reputation after nearly...
Kind of reinforces that whole snapping turtle thing.
It sure does. By that point, as these Federals are making their counterattack, Lee realizes how exposed this is, and he's got his line sort of now extending down in this direction. So he's going to pull these men back from here to this direction and to basically give up the hill even as Meade is trying to retake it. So the Federals will get this piece of high ground. Now, this is really important because had the Confederates kept this, it would allow them to enfilade the Federal line with artillery. So it seems like overall a small action to begin with, but it's really important for the security of the Federal line that they still have that, even if they've lost their opportunity for a major assault against that position. Now, we've talked about the military aspects. One of the things that I find kind of sad, and Sarah, I'm going to kind of shift over to here in a second, is there was a caretaker who lived in the house at the time. The home was owned by a guy named John Henry Myer, and he had a caretaker who was living in the house at the time of the battle, and the caretaker takes some pot shots at the Federal troops, so they set the farmhouse on fire and burn it down. And John Myer, who is in the Confederate Army at the time, stationed at Heath Salient, is able to see the column of smoke rising up from the hilltop that he owns, and nothing he can do about it. But imagine just being there in the lines and watching what you're certain is the destruction of your property. Sarah, can you tell me a little bit about John Henry Myer and the story of him and his family there?
Certainly. There we go. All right. So John Henry Myer, he actually immigrated to the United States from Germany, and he settled in Fredericksburg, Virginia in 1846. And he starts off his time in Fredericksburg working as a saddler or saddle maker. And then in 1852, he makes this sudden change of jobs, and he opens up a bakery and a confection shop or a candy shop. That business becomes highly successful, and he operated at the address of 212 William Street, which is a good location in downtown Fredericksburg, and he keeps expanding his business. And so he seems to be having, financial success and is becoming this key member of the Fredericksburg community. He was married. His wife's name was Mary Elizabeth. And by the time of the Civil War, they had 3 young children. And those children's names were Mary, John Jr., and then Annie. Now, after the Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862, the Myers, they had refugeed away from the town like many of the civilians did to get away from the fighting and the Union artillery bombardment. The Myer home actually survived the artillery damage, but the economy, if you will, in Fredericksburg was shot. I know that's probably a very bad pun, but it's destroyed. And so Myer needs to find another way to support his family. He also wants to move them away from Fredericksburg, because the Battle of Fredericksburg was not the first time that there had been troops in the city. And so he decides, well, let's move south. We'll get out in the country, Spotsylvania County, near the courthouse. And he buys this farm, which we now call Myers Hill. And good location, overlooks the Nye River. But then the war kind of comes for him again in 2 very literal senses. First off, John Henry Myer gets conscripted. So the Confederate draft laws, the ages kept changing for men who were in the age range to be drafted, and he gets taken, he's conscripted into the 40th Virginia Infantry, and as Chris pointed out, he's at Heath Salient in the Battle of Spotsylvania and able to see evidence of the destruction that would have been going on at his property at Myers Hill. Now, for his wife and children, they were not at the farm when the battle occurred there. They had refugeed away again. There was a caretaker there, as Chris mentioned. His name was Thomas Jett. He was 52 years old. He's listed as a laborer in the county documents, and he's described as a temporary occupant of the house, so probably someone hired to keep an eye on the property. The problem kind of came about because Jett took some shots at Federal troops as they were coming back into the area in the counterattack. And a Federal surgeon recorded that, quote, "We burned the large house and outbuildings because the owner was a rebel. and upon our evacuating, fired into our demoralized ranks. It was a good building, and its destruction helped to pay for that shot. After the war, John Henry Myer survives. He's going to come back with his family to the city of Fredericksburg, and he'll actually eventually open up a flour mill that is very successful. And he was a prominent community leader until his death, taking a role in the civic government and just overall community leadership. So in some ways I know in this area here in Central Virginia, he's often compared to Wilmer McLean, the civilian at Manassas, who then moves on and settles at Appomattox. And we kind of say, well, Wilmer McLean was pursued by war. And there's often some comparisons made to Myer and McLean, and that it seems like they're pursued by war. But in many ways, it's similar to other civilian experiences, trying to stay one step ahead of this conflict that's disrupting all of their lives. I think the positive part of Meyer's story is that he and his family are able to return to the Fredericksburg community and continue their lives there. They decided not to stay at Myers Hill. The ruins of their home and barn and ice house are included in the land that is preserved by Central Virginia Battlefields Trust. So that's a really unique part of what's available as historic resources on this property.
One of the things that I like about the property so much is you got all these cool stories. You've got this Wilmer McLean-esque civilian story that Sarah just recounted. The 140th New York, which makes that initial assault to capture the hill, a Zouave regiment from near Rochester, New York. So you've got these colorful Zouave uniforms and units that are involved with this. Emory Upton, who of course, is one of the young up-and-coming guys in the Union Army, earned his star shortly after the breakthrough there at Spotsylvania at the Mule Shoe on the 10th. I'm kind of brain farting, apologize. So you got all that, and of course, Meade's near capture. So you've got all these great stories that are associated with this piece of ground. Terry, why did this piece of ground then go unpreserved for so long when it's got all these great strands of history?
Well, it's part of the often overlooked second week of the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. And it's kind of, as the map shows, a little bit of a distance away from the national park. And it's just so much has happened in this area, it just kind of was overlooked when it came to preservation and
I'll show you
and that sort of thing. And the owner, was in no hurry to do anything there.
Since you mentioned that there's a distance between the property, here it is, Myers Hill. Here's where the Park Service boundary ends. So it is detached. It's separated by a big housing development. So that physical detachment contributes to what Terry's talking about. Sorry to interrupt you there. Go ahead.
That's quite all right. And so much of the story of the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse is based around the action of the first week and the action around the Mule Shoe that, sometimes some stories just don't get told or aren't as prominent as others. And so I think that that's one reason why it might have gone so long without being preserved. But luckily for all of us, it was left in this, state of nature. All these years. It is, like Sarah said, kind of scrub brushy, second growth forest land, subdivisions on 2.5 sides. So, and it's also a bit landlocked. There was really no direct way into it. So those were all things that kind of worked in our favor in the end. That has left it this, pristine, piece of land and in its natural state. There's been conversations on and off over the years, and finally in 2018, we were able to come forward and come to an arrangement with the previous owner and purchase the property. And
who has been great to work with.
He has been absolutely fantastic. And at the end of the day, he wanted it preserved just as much as we wanted to preserve it. So we were able to work something out to make that happen. And the long process of paying for it and figuring out what kind of interpretation and preservation we want to do and making that happen has begun.
So we can look forward to more Myers Hill stories and access eventually down the road as CVBT continues to develop the property and the story and the interpretation.
Yeah, yes, and it's one of 3 pieces of property that we've preserved there in the Spotsylvania Courthouse area. We have 40 acres along the Po River. We also in 2018 preserved 14 acres right there on Brock Road, kind of an area that was a rally point for the 5th Corps, right in the heart of the battlefield, and now the 73 plus acres there at Myers Hill. So we've done preservation on both ends and in the center of the battlefield to help tell the whole story. Of
and of
the
course, you talk about
acres we've preserved, about 130 there are in Spotsylvania.
And you talk about the overlooked second week of the battle, and that sort of culminates with Harris Farm, which is also another CVBT property holding. And what I think is kind of a neat little spot, an unfortunate little coda for the Army of Northern Virginia is 7,000 men of the Second Corps really find themselves overwhelmed by an influx of fresh federal reinforcements marching to the battlefield. And a great story. There's now a low density housing development that covers most of that ground, but because the houses in there aren't totally crammed on top of each other, you can still at least see the rolling nature of the landscape and get a little sense of that wide open area that the federal fresh reinforcements came in and they just stood in the open field and exchanged fire with these grizzled veterans of the Confederate Second Corps. So a very compelling story there. Before we wrap up, I'll ask each of you if you want to pitch in with any final thoughts or words about Myers Hill. Sarah, I'll pitch it over to you first. Any concluding thoughts?
I had a lot to learn about Myers Hill, and there's still a lot that I am learning. I think, like many people, I think of Spotsylvania's history as just kind of, oh, the angle, and then there was some other fighting, right? But there's so much to explore in that second week of the Battle of Spotsylvania, and really getting to connect, get boots on the ground at Myers Hill. That's been really exciting since I've been working with Central Virginia Battlefields Trust. And I'm going to be really excited and look forward to sharing in the coming months and years how we're able to do interpretation and hopefully open up some more public access there. That's something that I'm excited to see develop and am lucky to be able to work on.
Wonderful. Terry, how about you? Any final thoughts about Myers Hill?
Yes, thanks, Chris. It's this fascinating story. It's a fascinating military story. It's a fascinating civilian story. It's a fascinating story about the ground and how that plays into everything. It's a fascinating story of the second week of the battle. I'm really looking forward to being able to do more there. Sarah and I have had lots of conversations about, what we might be able to do there, the promise that it holds as far as historic interpretation. We're also trying to work on some other things in that area and kind of expand the story. And it's through, these efforts that we're able to tell, the story of our history as America. And I'm just thrilled that I came on board with CVBT at a time just as this project is really getting rolling.
And I know a lot of our viewers are familiar with the American Battlefield Trust. CVBT and ABT work very closely on a lot of preservation projects. So they're good partners. ABT has that national view and CVBT has sort of the boots on the ground view. And that's how the two complement each other very well. But I think that the vital story here is that preservation is not possible without the support of people like you who are committed to understanding and appreciating the value of this history and recognizing that these battlefields are very important primary source resources for us. And so by saving them and passing them on to those who come after us, we're able to not only preserve, but better understand these valuable pieces of American history. So I want to thank Sarah and I want to thank Terry for joining us here, Sarah Beirle and Terry Rensel in their capacities with Central Virginia Battlefield Trust. I'm Chris Mackowski. Thank you so much for joining us today. We will see you online and on the battlefield.